Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this lecture in our lecture series, Ancient Adornment. And our lecturer this afternoon is Dr. Bruno Biermann. And Dr. Biermann, Bruno, is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Münster. And Bruno's research bridges gender and feminist approaches to archaeology, iconography, and biblical literature. Bruno is particularly interested in social history, in the construction of bodies, and in gender in the ancient world. Bruno got his PhD degree from the University of Bern this year in 2024. The title of Bruno's PhD thesis, which is also in the chat, so you can read it there, is Stamp Seals as a Prism for the Gender History of the Southern Levant, Archaeological, Epigraphic, Iconographic, and Exegetical Explorations. In his PhD thesis, Bruno worked on stamp seals from the 2nd and 1st millennium BCE, and he used these, as the title says, as a prism for gender history. I also want to mention to you that from 2020 to 2024, Bruno was part of a research called project, a Synergia research project, so transnational research project, and it was called Stamp Seals from the Southern Levant, a multifaceted prism for studying entangled histories in an interdisciplinary perspective. And the project has a website. It's called levantineseals.org. The address for the project's website is also on the events page of our faculty's website, so you can go and find it there in case you want to check out some of the research they did, both Bruno's research but also some of the other project members. I want to mention two publications of Bruno's for you today that I think will be of particular interest for those of you attending this lecture. One was published this year in 2024 in the journal Near Eastern Archaeology, volume 87. The title is Male Until Proven Otherwise, ? Searching for Women with the Help of Inscribed Stamp Seals from Jerusalem. And the other publication I want to mention to you is not published yet, but it will be very soon. The official publication date is 6 December. It's in print right now. And it's a special issue of the journal Welt des Orients. And Bruno is one of the co-editors of this volume. And the title is Challenging Dichotomies and Biases in the Study of the Ancient Southern Levant. So, as you can tell from this introduction, it's a very innovative young scholar that we have giving a talk for us today. I always find Bruno's work incredibly inspiring and stimulating, and I'm so pleased that he accepted the invitation to present for us this afternoon. So with this, I'll give the Zoom room to Bruno. The title of his talk today is Levantine Seals Between the Material, Sensory, and the Social. And just bear with us for 1 minute while Bruno shares his screen, and then we're good to go. So Bruno, a warm welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here. Always also presenting in a circle that Anne, you are presiding over, is always a big pleasure. So I was very happy for the invitation. And I'm also very happy to see some familiar faces, especially also a few other members of the Stem Cells project are also here. So very happy to see you all. Now let's see if that works. And please let me know if you don't hear me okay.
During the
presentation.
Yeah.
And now we just have to start, and you should see the title screen.
Yep, very good. Thank you. And if any of you are experiencing problems along the way with either sound or image, just feel free to write to me in the chat.
Great, thank you. With that, let me start. So I have enough time to speak about what I want to present to you today. In today's presentation, I want to draw together two aspects of my research on materiality and the body in the ancient Southern Levant, a sensory and a gender historical perspectives. And I'm doing so by drawing on one particular object, as you might already expect from this region. namely seals, and mostly stamp seals, but not exclusively. First, in the introduction, I will present briefly the objects of study, the research questions, and the scope of my lecture in terms of geography and also chronology. Second, I will then turn to the intersection of seals and the human body based on the objects themselves, the archaeological contexts, and ancient Near Eastern iconography and literature, before turning in the third section to the focus on the role of seals for engendering the body, so focusing on one particular aspect of embodiment and the body as a social but also experiential and experienced subject. And finally, I will draw both sections together in my conclusion and reflect on the potential and relevance of intersecting these two approaches for the study of the ancient southern Levant and the ancient world more broadly. So let's start first with the subject or the object of study of today, mainly seals. And as you can see, these are just a more or less random selection of seals from the southern Levant, archaeologically found in excavations, already giving you an idea of the diversity of this object type. Seals are miniature objects of ancient daily life, often merely the size of a centimeter or even less. Seals are found since the Neolithic in the southern Levant and the Levant more broadly for millennia. And thereby they're an ideal medium for long-term studies of different kinds of interest. In the southern Levant, the majority of seals are stamp seals, as you can see an example here. They're made from different solid materials and usually, but not always, engraved, enabling them to produce impressions on clay and other soft surfaces, such as vessels here, jar handles, and clay bullae. Seals were part of clothing and dress, and particularly jewellery. They sealed vessels and shipments or also contracts, among other objects. Seals could also function as amulets worn on the body during lifetime and were given with the deceased into the grave. These multifunctional objects are thus closely related to human bodies, which makes them an ideal approach or the object for a sensory approach, but also an ideal object for gender history and gender archaeology. The categorization of these objects and their base engraving, so particularly iconography and inscriptions, epigraphy, have received the majority of scholars' attention. My starting point is in a way a slightly different one. It is the relationship between seals and the body in material culture, but also in other media such as iconography and literature, focusing on the engendered but not exclusively engendered body. This is an aspect that often in scholarly publications, but also excavation reports, is less tangible and therefore something that has to be synthetically reconstructed. My presentation will address two main questions today. The first one is how are seals related to the body in the ancient Levant? And second, how are seals part of the somatization of gender in the ancient Levant? Finally, the scope of my presentation and research concerns provenance objects, seals, but also seal impressions from the southern Levant in particular, and investigates the chronological horizon from the Middle Bronze Age II until the Persian period. This is enriched by iconographic evidence and literature more broadly from the ancient Near East and the Levant more broadly, also the northern Levant. As the lecture focuses on the human body and its interaction with seals, the aspect of seals as image-bearing media or text-bearing media, and their role for understanding the history of religions of the region, including body imagery and gendered body imagery, is not addressed today, despite that being actually a part in my research projects in general. My lecture builds largely on a PhD thesis and is related to the study framework that Anne also mentioned in the beginning, the Swiss-Israeli research project Stem Cells of the Southern Levant, that was funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation from 2020 to 2022. And the project completes and completed largely the corpus of stem cells from the southern Levant, done for the first decades by Ottmar Kehl, and has transferred this into an open access corpus database. But it also produces and has produced multiple PhDs and habilitations and other works and book projects in the fields of archaeology of the Levant, biblical studies, and the history of religions. Seals and the human body, the sensory perspective. In recent years, the body in its material, somatic, and experiential dimension has drawn increasing interest in academic research about the ancient world. Various disciplines invested in the study of the ancient Near East have engaged aspects of embodiment, dress, affect, sensoriality, but also gender and sexuality in relation to material culture, visual culture, but also literature. One of these approaches is sensory archaeology. Sensory archaeology, in the words of Yanis Hamilakis, attempts to come to terms with the fully embodied experiential meta-reality of the past. In other words, they are attempts to come to terms with the skin and the flesh of the world. Sensory archaeology thus investigates how ancient people perceived their environment, interacted with it, but also, for example, how they extended and modified their bodies and thereby also their experiences of being embodied. Since conceptualizations, but also experiences of the senses are culturally shaped and controlled, sensory archaeology is also concerned with reconstructing these specific cultural processes and at the same time questions our contemporary models, academic, but also more broadly public models of understanding the senses and how adequate they are applicable to the ancient world. Just to say, for example, the discussion on Plato's model of the five senses and the distinction between certain senses being superior to other senses is something that is specific to contemporary contexts. Of course, not all in a global perspective. Also ancient ones, but certainly does not speak for the entire ancient Near East, for example, in all periods. When turning to seals now and addressing the question, how are seals related to the body in the ancient Levant, I want to start with looking at the objects themselves through the lens of affordances, then briefly outline what the archaeological find context can tell us, and then what iconographic and literary depictions may complement and extend our perspective on the relation between the body and seals in the ancient Near East and the Levant. The focus thus lies on this intersection with a particular interest in the sensory perception and experiences. The first, affordances. The concept of affordance grasps how the physical properties of an object, quote unquote, invites interaction. And how do these interactions negotiate physicality and cultural production? So that's something that connects an approach to affordances with sensory archaeology. While the term was coined by the psychologist Gibson, it has been widely adapted into archaeological theory, for example, by Karl Knappett, and studies of the stem cells of the Southern Levant member Noah Ranzer has applied the theoretical concept of Knappett and Gibson to stem cells in the Southern Levant particularly. Due to their small size, seals are mobile objects that could fulfill various purposes. The object's affordances provide indications of their potentials for connecting to the human body. The perforation hole of a seal may present that is present on the majority of objects enables a string to hold the object on a ring or a necklace. Alternatively, a bezel could enable the object to be worn on the body in various ways. Thus, the seals in their mounting modified their affordances and thereby their way of integrating into the body and dress and jewellery specifically. On this, I want to move on quickly to the aspect of sensory experience and affordances. How did these affordances translate into sensory experience? And there, my perception and conceptualization highlights how the visual, haptic, and kinesthetic experiences intersect in particular. So first, briefly to visuality. A sealed size, the physical shape, the material, the color, but also the engraving, how it was worn on the body even more, modulated its appearance, but also potentially its function and meaning. Touch and kinesthesia. Wearing and using seals produce tactile experiences by combining the sense of movement and touch. Not only in the act of sealing, but especially in the act of sealing, is this to be perceived today. Under the pressure of one's hands, the seal created an inverse rendering of its base, transforming clay into its positive copy. Compared to the material and its display on the body, the iconography or the inscription on the base of a seal may have been far less accessible to others unless the object was pressed on clay and in a way thereby released into the world. This intimacy of a sealed surface is also evident in the fact that a seal could be read visually and also haptically in many ways. The visual, tactile, and kinesthetic senses were intertwined in acts of social practices such as displaying and wearing and using seals in the ancient world that are partially reconstructible, but also partially unable for us to grasp today. Therefore, it's really important also to entertain archaeological projects such as experimental archaeology that can fill in gaps. The project by Noah Ranzer and Nathan Linon in our studies of the stem seals project, producing and wearing stem seals, further showed how the intersections of these seals and social dynamics in the group that experienced and wore these objects were heavily intertwined. And thereby, I don't just want to highlight how important these approaches are for helping us understand the little things that are often lost in the archaeological record here. Moving on to archaeological contexts, these can illuminate specific cultural practices realizing certain affordances of objects. This is especially the case in funerary contexts, as here for one of the tombs from the western slope of Mount Zion from Jerusalem, so dated to the Iron III period, mostly in the case of the tomb A, although it has a bit of a longer period of use, starting in the Iron IIB probably already. In the context of tombs and funeral practices, seals integrated into assemblages with other seals, with beads, pendants, and or were connected, for example, to textiles that we don't find in the archaeological record anymore, but also other elements of dress. Moreover, also we have to consider the intersection to other funerary goods, such as pottery vessels. The majority of the archaeological evidence of sealware in relation to the body is found in tombs. Sometimes the seal was found on the body it was deposited in many millennia ago, but in most cases, the preservation of the material, the burial practices, and the archaeological practices of excavating these tombs hinder a precise determination of the relationship between the so-called small finds and individuals buried in tombs, especially in the case of multiple interments. Instead, it's important to recognize that seals integrate into these novel assemblages that are created in funerary contexts out of the different objects and including bones, but also seals, pottery, jewellery, etc. A caveat of the fact that we are mostly looking at funerary contexts for intersecting seals and bodies is that practices in everyday life remain in a way ambiguous, and we are maybe too much projecting the funerary evidence onto lived evidence and lived reality of ancient people. Thereby, cases where you find bodies of individuals outside of funerary contexts are particularly important. And here, the case of Late Bronze Age 3 Tel Azekah is particularly prominent. During the excavations of the Lautenschläger expedition at Azekah, In Area T2, excavators unearthed multiple skeletons, two of which, one subadult and one adult, probably female, osteological sex skeleton, were found with multiple stamp seals in the form of scarabs and amulets, also of base and patikos. Also, some additional beads were found with the skeletons, not displayed here on the slide. During the destruction of the site in the late Bronze Age 3, these and many more individuals were killed by fire and then covered by debris. This is the first case, probably in the southern Levant in total, that individuals can be directly associated with fields outside of funerary contexts. Turning to the iconography now, we have to recognize a certain gap. So there is no depiction of seal use or seal wear in the southern Levant in general. So we have to turn towards the ancient Near East more broadly and also include a broader chronological scope to get any kind of material and data. In the early dynastic period, we find a shell plaque at Nippur displaying a woman possibly wearing a cylinder seal on her wrist. In the late Bronze Age, we find possible depictions of seal wear, at least that's how it is interpreted in the literature, on bull rider friezes at Tel Daba here, at the royal palace of Thutmose III, or slightly earlier. The dating is debated currently, depicting corridors that we know from the middle Minoan frescoes at Knossos that I have not shown here in this case. Now, of course, you may wonder if these are seals and what kind of seals they may be in these cases. This is a correct observation of the ambiguity of this kind of evidence. When we turn to later periods, and also still the 18th dynasty, we find also some depictions of seal wear. Here, Amenhotep Hui receives the royal seal probably from the royal sealer. And in a 13th dynasty wall relief at Memphis, we find a vizier wearing a signet ring on his finger. These stylizations, turning to all four that I chose for today, of silver reflect specific wear practices, but also visual agendas of their respective periods, the regions, but also of the specific patrons responsible for the production of these artworks. They include material from the 3rd millennium Nippur to 4th century Egypt. The material is thus quite distinct from the Levant, not only chronologically and geographically, but also in terms of the object's depiction, wear, and use. Thus, we cannot directly project this evidence onto the southern Levant and in understanding the local practices. On the other hand, the iconographic evidence, I think, can help us to understand how seal wear is related to specific body stylizations. It can create social belonging, perform social status, but also construct and transfer power and authority. All these are aspects that are often intangible in the archaeological record itself, but also not directly accessible through the objects themselves through affordances. But it's something that, of course, comes heavily into the analysis from certain theories, but also has been highlighted by experimental archaeological approaches. So I think that is where the iconographic evidence can actually help us to understand the material better and more diversely. Finally, turning to literature, I want to focus on how seals are used in language with a few examples, in particular, focus on seal use in metaphors. In my previous work on seals and the senses, I have linked sensory archaeology more excessively in terms of theory with cognitive linguistics to understand this connection between ancient bodily practices and language. Cognitive linguistics understands metaphor not as merely a static device, but as a cognitive structure of human thought shaped by bodily practices. Such an approach enables the study of the human body as multivalent through archaeological material, but also through literature. As an example, I want to look first into the Song of Songs and then briefly into New Kingdom love poetry. The Song of Songs can be characterized as a literary performance between two voices, a grammatically male and a grammatically female speaker, longing for each other with every inch of themselves. The passage about love being as strong as death in Song 8, verse 6, is commonly interpreted as the climax of the text, including the following verse, not shown here, where we read, "Set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm, because strong as death is love, harsh as Sheol, the underworld is passion, her flames are flames of fire, a raging flame." Becoming a seal on the other's body is here the imperative of the female speaker. Typically for love poetry, the lovers in the Song of Songs long for each other, but they are never fully realizing their longing. So they are not ever meeting in within the world of the text. They never engage in a physical encounter, but the desire is all the more intense, therefore. Metaphors, especially the seal metaphor in this text, manifests this desire for a tangible encounter despite its intangibility. I want to emphasize here the parallels between the senses involved in seal wear and use in material culture and in this metaphor. The speaker asks for an intimate and permanent encounter with her lover through the placement on his body. Touch, in the sense of the two bodies merging into one, is conceptualized as a particularly permanent mode of perception here. Not only does the seal manifest her desire for the other, but it renders her present. The heart and arm here in this verse are not merely physical places, but a deeper exegetical study quickly shows that they evoke anthropological concepts that are linked to bodily perceptions. And these underline the heart emphasizes seeing, knowledge, and emotional activity. The arm determines the seal as a placement at the location of physical strength, but also protection and ability. The placement of the seal on the body also displays the body with this lover to the others, to the outside. That is particularly important in Song 8, verse 6, because in the poem overall, but also in chapter 8, the lovers are challenged by their surrounding, especially their family members, especially the female lovers' family members that is speaking here in this verse too. Looking to the New Kingdom love poetry, there is a long train of scholarship that has noted the similarities between the New Kingdom love poetry from Egypt and the Song of Songs, despite their historical distance, since the Song of Songs by now is very clearly dated, rather late, so Persian or Hellenistic. The interesting thing is also in the New Kingdom love poetry that the lovers are desiring for a permanent encounter, and this is where the seal metaphor particularly comes in. So the speakers say, if only I were her little seal ring, the keeper of her finger, I would see her love each and every day. The small size of the signet ring in this context underlines the desired intimacy, and combines here with the aspect of permanent embrace, but also display on the other's body. So how are seals related to the body in the ancient Levant? A brief intermediate summary before we turn to the end aspect of gender. From the investigation of the first main questions, I draw three key conclusions based on the intersections of seals and bodies that I trace through affordances, the archaeological context, the iconography, and ancient Near Eastern literature. First, seals can be understood as sensorial prosthesis to the body, negotiating bodily experiences and boundaries. This highlights the material culture's active role in the construction of the body in specific spaces, communities, and interactions. Particularly, the aspect of dress is here important and underlined by the iconographic and textual evidence. The fact that seals enable unlimited reproduction of their bases underlines this communicative significance of the communities using these objects. Second, on a sensory level, I see a synesthesia, so a blending together of different senses in seal use and wear that concern particularly the tactile, kinesthetic, and visual senses. And third, I see particularly a link between seals and the body in how they are encoded in language, how seals become metaphors, but also used in narrative contexts. There we see that especially the issue of bodily presence is something that seal metaphors are useful and employed in. On the other hand, it's important to emphasize that these metaphors that have a longevity over millennia in the ancient Near East, in different regions and languages, are diverse in terms of the background of the material culture they imply. So in Egypt and the Levant, we have, for example, particularly stamp seals and signet rings as standing in the background of language and metaphor, while in texts from the ancient Near East more broadly, we also have texts that clearly refer to cylinder seals worn on the body. So we have local and chronological specific uses of these metaphors in front of us. Before I come to the conclusion, I want to draw out some key lines how now this can help us to understand our seals part of the somatization of gender in the ancient Levant. And for this, I briefly introduce the theoretical concept of my approach that I call material gender history. This approach understands gender as an analytical tool to the study of how bodies are becoming. It's building on feminist theory that is interested in the intersection of the material and the social. So it incorporates and engages with corporal feminism, new materialism, but also more material feminist approaches that are adapted to Bourdieu in particular. Sex and gender are therefore understood as co-constituted and not as dichotomic oppositions. Neither is sex merely natural, nor is gender entirely social. For my approach, central is the concept of somatization from Pierre Bourdieu and the reception of this context by gender theorist Andrea Mayhofer as understanding gender as a hegemonial mode of being. The concept of somatization grasps how the social becomes material through the habitus. Through somatization, social dispositions and norms become embodied through practice while appearing natural. Thereby, social hierarchies become material in and on bodies of individuals. However, it's important to highlight that the body is not only the site of inscription and normativity, but also an agent with subjectivity. Transformation, adaptation, transgression, and resistance processes can result in aberration or even conflicts with the material apparatus that may leave traces in the material record. And that is something that gender archaeological approaches have highlighted in particular. To close with, on this topic, I want to highlight the aspect of bioarchaeology for the Southern Levant, because it's something that has been understudied for a long period of time. Most seals do not bear their owners' names or give any indication of their identity. An archaeological approach based on osteological sex estimation of adult skeletons provides an alternative perspective on seal wear and use. Osteological analysis can provide manifold information about age, sex, habitual activities, nutrition, but also diseases and causes of death. bioarchaeological sex estimation categorizes human physiology on a spectrum between two dimorphic poles. The bodies of individuals are shaped by social norms and also individual practices through which social and skeletal expressions of gender manifest. It has to be noted, however, that funerary practices and also osteological data more broadly does not necessarily give reliable information about practices during lifetime, and also does not represent the complexity of social gender roles in any given society. In my PhD study, I analyzed the basically all available contexts in which osteological data was available in relation to seals in the Southern Levant, including periods from the Middle Bronze Age to until the Persian period. That includes in total 135 objects from 20 sites. And the interesting thing is, when we look at this, is that there is generally no sex-specific distribution of seals in the Levant from the Ambi until the Iron Age, at least the Iron 2B. More than osteological sex, it is apparent that age-shaped funeral practices involving seals. Here, as an example, you see a strong indication of seal use with sub-adult burials at Tellus Hadia. A male tendency only emerges in contexts where seals are scarce, especially in the Persian period Jordan Valley, here represented by the cemetery of Al-Mazar. This underlines the role of seals in constructing multiple aspects of social belonging and identity. The analysis of the material, the object type, the iconography, but also the placement on the body showed that previous studies have not engaged sufficiently with the quote-unquote messiness of the data set. So instead of looking at dichotomic categories, binary categories, male and female, old and young, adult and child, it is necessary to look at the intersection of multiple aspects and regional practices and patterns, and how they change also at specific sites. And that shows that osteological sex is a rather insignificant factor compared to others, and also does not give us a clear picture on seal use and practices of seal use that have to be understood in a much more complex framework. I will jump over the epigraphic material. As Anne mentioned, that is also already in some ways published. I want to close with the issue of memory and how seal use and who uses seals is translated into literature. So again, moving from the archaeology to the literature, the interesting thing is that concerning biblical literature, that this literature underlines how seals are linked to power and the performance of power. And these objects, seals, are used to materialize power in specific situations. Seals are part also of elaborate dress, but mostly of male figures. This includes specific male elite actors and royal priestly actors within the Hebrew Bible, but also the divine body itself. But also in the book of Nehemiah, we find the idea that all male Israelite men in Jerusalem own their own seal to seal the contract with God, the post-exilic contract with God. Significant, therefore, is that we find that no text considers women as wearers or owners of their own seals and sealers of contracts. The same can be said for sub-adults, of course, in this case. On the other hand, we have stories of Tamar, Isabel, and Esther that subvert masculinities of specific male actors through seal use and wear as instruments of power. So the seal becomes an instrument of subversion in these three stories, and is particularly linked to the aspect of writing and authoritative writing. And thereby, these three stories, despite being literary fictions, show us how strongly seals are linked to performative aspects of social life. Drawing together in the conclusion, I want to highlight that seals are essential and crucial aspect for studying and reconstructing lived realities, but also representations of the body and embodiment in the ancient Levant. Significantly biblical representations of material culture are unreliable witnesses in many ways, and thereby material culture becomes fundamental to social history, studying gender, economy, family relations, but also bodily practices. Moving towards the synthesis of sensory and gender archaeology, I think there is a lot of research, but also theoretical work to be done. For example, I wonder, what role did the sensory experiences play in becoming engendered? And how did gender shape sensory experiences? And what function did have gender for the development of the senses throughout lifetime and different life cycles? And I think there we need to do some more research on the level of theory, but also in terms of our data set. And with that, thank you. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Bruno. Please, I hope you'll join me in thank you, Bruno, for this excellent talk, this incredibly interesting sample of his research on seals. Thank you so much. I'm going to do a proper hand clap and not a Zoom one, but thank you.
Still trying to find you again, but I'm back.
Okay, good. Welcome back. No, thank you so much, Bruno. And now we have plenty of time for questions, comments. So please, the floor is open, and you can either raise a Zoom hand or write to me in the chat in case you'd like to ask a question. So please go ahead. And I do realize that some of you will not be able to turn on cameras and sound depending on where you are in the world. But if you can, please do so. It's nice for me and Bruno to be able to see you. Thank you. I think I'd like to start us off, if I may, Bruno, with a question. I'm a little bit obsessed with adornment and jewellery questions at the moment. So one of my
at the moment?
No, well, chronically, I'm afraid. So one of the questions that came to mind was about the sensorial impact of seals. And I think what always strikes me, and also looking at you and Silas sort of posing with the seals in Syracuse at the conference last year, very nice, by the way, is how small seals are. I mean, they seem, compared to a human body, they seem quite tiny, actually. So they're definitely not statement jewelry. At the same time, I think when I sort of compare to the jewelry I've seen from mostly the Iron Age Levant, they're not uncharacteristically small. I mean, so I have two questions in a way. So is that also your impression that seals size-wise sort of fit into the general profile of Iron Age Levantine jewelry, that they're not either too small or too large? So they sort of fit the model somehow. And also thinking about how relatively small they are on the human body, would that to you indicate that the sensorial aspect is in a way more important than the visual? Or I was just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Thank you. I mean, I think there is a multi-layered answer there for me, because one of the seals that's not on the picture, which I have here from the experiment, it's actually almost three times the size of an average Levantine seal. Like it's huge. You can see it's like way too big. Normally the size would be maybe a fingernail size. Like if I wear this on my neck, I mean, obviously it's huge, but you can tell I wear, like, it's very obvious in a way. The question is, how do we wear it? If I wear it like this, you might not even notice. So it relates to the aspect of integration into dress that we can't really, in the end, we don't really know. In the sense of like, did you wear it below your shirt or above? I mean, we can speculate, but on the other hand, you cannot read what's written on there. So visuality has, you can see the color, you can see the shape maybe. So I think actually that I think the aspect of what's engraved on them is much more intimate than the objects themselves. And that's something that Noah, who's also here, actually showed in the experiments also, is how quickly people perceive these tiny objects. So people that didn't get seals in the experiment felt excluded quickly. And you can imagine how that creates scholarly dynamics that are very interesting. So I think actually that in the one hand, we have to highlight how the base of these objects is overestimated in history of religion and epigraphy. But on the other hand, how even though they are very tiny, they are very visible also. They can move. They can be part of bigger assemblages of necklaces, for example, or rings. Finger rings are very visible. I mean, even if you wear it, like just because it's on your fingers and you're all the time interacting. So I had a lot of people ask me about the ring, for example. Yeah. Of course, it's quite big. I mean, it's a scarab. It's like I have it somewhere here too, but yeah,
it looks like, quite uncomfortable. Was it uncomfortable?
It's quite big.
Yeah, it is.
Like, a bit big, but it works. It actually works.
No, and how is it to wear now that you've actually done it? Is it something that you get used to quite quickly, or?
I mean, you get used to it quite quickly. The ring, I mean, this was one of the first that Nate produced, our colleague from Tel Aviv. So he got way more elaborate very quickly. So for me, it was just, I mean, to be honest, it scratches my laptop. So it was like, it's about the affordances conflicting with my main occupation that made me take it off. But other than that, it's not so terrible, actually.
Okay. Not so terrible. Great. Thank you. Thanks. That's really helpful. Melanie, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this really interesting lecture. I was wondering whether you could perhaps expand a little bit on how you cross the conceptual to the practical. So if you've been indicating, especially with this sensory archaeology approach, very much this question of what does it actually mean in practice to wear, to use, but usually that's not what we have. When I deal with the seals or seal impressions I need to deal with, they are coming as impressions on tablets. They are coming potentially from graves, but not necessarily recorded well enough that I would actually know exactly where they were worn, if at all they would have been still worn on the body when the body was put into the grave. So my question is, in a way, or it's more an invitation for you to please elaborate a bit on it, on how, if you are having then your find, whether it's the seal impression or the seal in a semi-known context, how you make use of your conceptual and practical approaches to dealing with it. So how you manage to apply it so that these two approaches actually meet. I find this often the most difficult to do. And I would be interested in how you did it, or what your thoughts are on how this could be most suitably done.
Thank you. Yeah, you point out the struggle I had for about a year. Like this is the big struggle in the end, because we have basically, I have the same problem all the time. to give you some numbers, we have in the studies of in the database that we have that we created, we have about a bit over 12,000 objects, which is quite a big data set for provenance objects from a rather small region. Most of these objects are not at all relevant for this kind of approach because the context does not help us, or the type of object, or etc. So we basically for example, most tombs do not help much. I mean, basically for the Iron Age, for example, in the Southern Levant, because it's basically all multiple interments and that have been used over often hundreds of years, and are usually disturbed afterwards. Basically, there are very few cases in west of the Jordan that are even relevant for a study that focuses on osteological data intersecting with bodies. So think of 135 objects and of 12,000, and almost 40 of these objects are from Tyre al-Bas, which isn't even in our data set for the Southern Levant, but I included. So like it's basically the Southern Levant in terms of, for this kind of research, we're really in the backwater. That is related to different aspects of dealing with also, especially for Iron Age material and Persian period material, with everything that's considered to be Jewish bones, cannot be in the same way analyzed and studied, of course. So there are some regional specifics, but also, I mean, in Syria and Jordan, there are some problems with the authorities usually. So it basically, just to say, it's a huge problem. And so basically for most individual objects, you can't really tell. You can tell from the affordances is the closest you can get usually to most objects, because that's the object you have. And that's where you start. And then you kind of try to systematize it, and add the data that you can. That's how I try to proceed. And therefore I extended the temporal period, like basically including from the MB until Persian period, enabled me to engage with data sets that are usually not compared, because specialists are like, I'm doing Iron Age, I'm doing MB, I'm doing LB. And then you are sitting on your island, but you can't really make sense of the material. And what in the end I realized is, it's something I had to sadly jump a bit over, is that, so basically for the Southern Levant, we see in different media and contexts, in epigraphy, in archaeological contexts, but also in biblical literature, we see how in the Persian period, maybe the Iron III already, seals start to be linked to male authority, and male subjects. But it's something we don't find in earlier periods with the data set we have available, at least. And that's linked especially to writing practices and the emergence and spread of writing practices. And if we compare that, for example, to Mesopotamia, we see similar aspects, that as soon as you look at epigraphic seals, women get much more invisible. There are a lot of studies, much more studies actually than for the Southern Levant, that have looked into this. And so therefore, this kind of like longue durée approach enabled me to make sense of this material in a better way. But of course, you get weaker in the tiny, like in the details, maybe at some points, because you have to hold together a lot. Yeah, I hope that makes some sense. Yeah.
Melanie, go ahead. I think you have a follow-up to this.
Well, it's not directly a follow-up or only partial follow-up. So if anyone else has a hand up, I don't want to take too much time.
Please.
But I'm struggling, or I've been starting to struggle with making sense out of both the seals and the seal impressions from the so-called Egyptian community of Assur. That's kind of the background of the questions. And the other thing I've been wondering, so in all my in the impressions I have, as far as I can judge from the documentation I have, there's no indication from the impression of how how the seal, the stamp seal, mostly scarabs and scaraboids, were actually impressed. So there are no parts of the ring at the edges or something like this. Yeah, so it's just the actual stamp seal and no additions as far as I can judge. And I was wondering whether you have been working on it, whether you can say, especially for the, let's say, the 8th to 6th century BCE, what you think is most likely on how the seals were then impressed, whether they were worn as a necklace, taken off and impressed, or was the necklace long enough so that you would seal while it was still on? The same with the seal ring. If the scarab was on the finger, would it be taken off for sealing it, or would it be sealed while still on the finger? Do you have any suggestions, or can you lead me to literature where I can check this up?
So, I mean, I don't want to just give the question to someone else, but Noah Ranzer is here actually, who is working on exactly that for the Southern Levant. So he's actually more of an expert for that. So Noah, if you want to jump in, feel free.
I can, if you want. So I think there are some indications for impressions with mounting. So you can actually see, normally you cannot differentiate if it's a suspension loop or a ring, but you can actually see a mounting frame that the seal was still connected. In some cases, not all. Yes, but that's, I mean, my partial answer. I think, Bruno, you can, give more.
Yeah, I think the first thing is to realize how locally diverse the wear practices are and how they change. It's also something, Noah, that you actually looked in the later periods, so it's hard to generalize. Like, I wouldn't claim that from the Southern Levant I can say there is more this or more that in Ashur, for example, because it's actually quite local phenomena, because these objects are often in many ways locally produced. On the other hand, you have maybe imperial aesthetics, so you have an influence in some periods of certain wear styles from Egypt or from Ashur, for example, or Mesopotamia, disseminating into the Southern Levant. I don't think that. The evidence in terms of do you take a ring apart? I don't think usually that is what's happening. In terms of, if you look at the rings that we find archaeologically, they're not made to be like, let's take this out and stamp it. That's usually not done, for example.
But that's not what I meant. I was meant whether to take it off and stamp it then, so that it would then be like a separate object, or whether you would have it still on the finger.
You would have it like on the finger, and you're like...
Or like this, rather more.
I think in a way it might be helpful to have more experiments on the different object shapes and how they impact. Because with a cylinder seal, it makes sense that you need to take it off, or you need to at least needs to be able to roll it. But with a stamp seal, it might be more easy to actually leave it on the finger. But for example, I couldn't even wear this on my finger inverted, like with the base to stamp. I could like this, but not. I couldn't put it on because of the actual object shape as a scarab here. But that's not really satisfying answer, maybe.
I have a feeling you know what you'll be wearing to the next conference as well. For more testing.
The lettermost thing is a really satisfying answer, because it actually is, if they are scarabs or scaraboids, the assumption is, both from comfort of wearing, but also from how it looks, that the scarab would be worn so that you see the scarab, that you see the beetle. But for impressing it, you would have to turn it around, and usually you have it fitting closely enough that you would have to take it off to turn the scarab round and then impress it. So that actually is a very satisfying idea. Thanks for that.
Brilliant.
I think maybe one last thought is that the question is, did people wear these rings all the time, and who could afford these rings? I mean, the material is not like today's rings, right? You can't go and pluck your garden with this kind of ring on your hand, maybe. So only with a certain profession or status or coming with certain privileges, you can be like, okay, I have my ring on and I can just stand. While in other situations, you might take it off. Like I take this off, like I had to take this off when doing lifting because it was squeezing my finger actually. Or it scratches on my computer. So I'm like, this doesn't work. So there comes also the aspect of the social and the social interaction, intersectionality, etc., into the question of the actual practices. Then, can you afford to sit around and seal all day?
I like that image. Thank you so much. Also, Noah, thank you for stepping in. And it's really, really interesting. Ulrike would like to make a comment as well. Please go ahead. I think you're still on mute, so you just have to unmute yourself. Perfect.
Oh, good evening, everybody. Hello, Bruno. Hello, Noah.
Hello.
Two things I would like to maybe add. One about the size of the seals, and the other thing, indeed, about the practical wearing. When you compare to, for example, depictions, Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom of high officials wearing cylinder seals, you can tell that they're wearing them either on a thread or on a necklace. And it's way too short to be able to indeed then do an impression on anything. So you have to take it off and then you do your sealing. But the way you are wearing it looks like closer here to your sternum. So I would not have any problem at all with assuming that most of the times you have to take your seal off if you really want to do an official act of sealing, be that a stamp seal or a cylinder seal. And when it comes to wearing those seals, well, you have the scarabs that are only on a piece of thread. For example, in the tomb of War, you have those. So when you wear a seal that is only on thread, and you wear it all the time, then probably you have to replace the thread regularly because that would wear thin. So again, it's something, do you do that every day or don't you do that every day? To Bruno's point. And about the, it doesn't necessarily have to then leave an imprint of a metal frame, of a bezel around this scarab, for example, when you impress it and it's only held on your finger with a piece of thread. The other point is, of course, that it's tricky to differentiate between seal rings that don't really have a seal, like when you look at the faience production in Amarna, when you simply have those, sorry to do that, one of those in faience, how do you differentiate between an imprint that is made by a seal made in faience and one that is basically just a seal ring? So that's a tricky part. The other point, if I may, is about the size of those objects. And I would say, that is one of the levels of meaning. In this case, if you say the bigger the better, or the more flashy, the more prestigious, this is one aspect of wearing a seal. But the other thing is really about the function. And when we compare, for example, how interchangeable materials are from blue glass or faience to real lapis lazuli, then it's the same with seals. As soon as you can seal something with it, it's a fully functioning thing that you can use, for example, for official acts or for magic. So I'd say if you see somebody who's not on the highest echelons of society and still wearing a seal, you will notice. This will be a person that is not decked up with jewelry, but has one piece. And I would say that is noticeable, no matter if it's relatively small for our standards or if it's big and flashy. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Those were very good points. Thanks. Bruno, would you like to jump in?
Thank you. No, I agree on many of the points. I think, in some ways the material from the Sun Levant is a bit different in terms of how many. We don't have many rings, faience rings, for example, materially attested from the region itself archaeologically. So there are a few differences in the data set and local practices, but overall, I think that's I agree.
If I may, the other thing about the size of the seal, I think the seal is simply an extension of the physical body and of the social body, if you will. I mean, that is so underlined by the fact that in Mesopotamia, you can seal with your fingernails or with the hem of your garment. So there again, I would say size doesn't matter in this context. In prestigious and other how you code the wealth of your household, for example, then size matters. But in that, not so much.
Thank you.
And more the assemblage, I think. And for example, if it's inlaid in gold, you will see that even if it's just a tiny piece, it will create the light reflection. There are many aspects where size does not matter, but glitter maybe matters more, or color.
Glitter always matters.
Yeah,
absolutely. No, that Jane had an interesting question as well, which is I think for Bruno, but maybe also others in here. Do you want to go ahead, Jane?
Yes, I was wondering if I know the materials used to make seals are hard materials, but have you noticed any evidence of wear on the seals that may help you indicate where they were worn on the body or whether they were older or newer?
Thank you. That's a very good and valid question. I mean, the question of age might also be answered in relation to fine context. I mean, we have, for example, seals from the MB, or more broadly from the Bronze Age that we find in Iron Age or even later contexts. That attest to seal use in other periods and show how objects have a long life, not just because of the traces of use, but because of the context. And actually, there is quite some interaction there because people, for example, depending on especially communities that you reuse tombs over centuries or in later periods, you dig out the old tombs and oh, nice, that's a nice scarab, let's put it somewhere. Or let's use them again. So that's happening in the Southern Levant in some. I mean, it's all regionally, locally specific, right? There are some. I mean, we can discern use on objects. It wasn't, for example, the primary goal of the project. We have a lot of high resolution photography done by project members that enable also observing use in quite some good degree already. And I mean, basically, there are objects that have clear indication of use where others don't. Basically, that's the general summary. I think we still have to do some more statistics maybe on that. That would be interesting. For specific periods, for example, where we see a lot of seal use in the Middle Bronze Age, for example. In tombs, were these all used during lifetime, or are they just deposited with the deceased? In this period, for example, is something that scholars are debating or having different opinions on. And it also depends on the material. I mean, there are some very hard materials where there is rather little use wear, and it depends on the type of wear. So is it inlaid in what kind of, like, how is it worn on the body? It is actually quite a complicated question to answer. Yeah. And what I wanted to do, for example, is to look more in seals that can be ascribed to women in the Iron Age and ask if they were used actually in practice. And so far, I wasn't able to do that analysis on the ground. I mean, you all know this current situation is not making stuff easier, but and setting different priorities. But I think useWare can help a lot more for very specific research questions, also concerning social history and gender, for example.
Thank you. Very, very interesting.
Thank you both. We're reaching the end of our time. So Noah, you'll get the final comment or question today.
Thank you. I just wanted to maybe try and answer also the useWare, because I looked up a bit of these. And so the problem is that many times it's hard to differentiate between, there are three causes for wear, for traces of either production. It can be the result of the production of the item. It can be the result of the actual wear, because they wore it, because they use it, or it can also be the deterioration of time. So you have all three. And I think to get the best results, you have to do experiments. So basically, both to produce and to wear, to see what happens when you wear the seals. And I think, so two things that I think I found, I suggest that are a result of wear. One is that some items have a broken frame line, like the contour of the object is slightly broken, and this can be a result of the mounting, that they were previously incorporated into mounting and was taken off. And this also connects to what Bruno said, that objects that are ancient in their find context, if you see a correlation between their antiquity and their find context, and you also have this worn kind of a frame, then I think you can maybe assume that they were previously mounted. And another thing was Bruno's ring is slightly broken in the sides. And we also have evidence for ancient seals that are actually broken near the perforation hole.
Like there you might even see.
Yeah, and then they are also found with the ring. So I think in some cases you can actually see that this was a result of the ring. And then you can get even more close to how it was actually worn. Yeah, that was my comments.
Thank you
and
so
reuse.
much.
We have reuse also.
That's true. Yeah.
Objects broken and then reshaped, or a jar handle made into a seal, and like all kinds of funny stuff. Like
yes.
Yeah.
It's just amazing. Thank you so much. Because we have reached the end of our time, I'm just going to read the comment that Melanie made in the chat rather than letting her say so herself. But she writes here, size may actually matter in a reverse way. Clay tablets to be sealed can be very small, thus only a small seal may fit it, and thus allow for sealing instead of fingernailing. And also craftsmanship on smaller objects may be more impressive. The smaller the object, the greater the craftsman. So I think those are also worthwhile points to think as we think further. And before I ask you to join me in thanking Bruno both for this incredibly interesting discussion and his excellent talk, I just want to do a small advertisement for what you can look forward to next week, because Melanie, who's here with us today, Dr. Melanie Wasmuth, is going to deliver the lecture next week on Friday, November 15th at 3 p.m. Oslo time, as always. And the title of Melanie's talk next week is Blossoms for Eternity, Floral Jewelry in Ancient Egypt. So if you like this, I think you're going to like Melanie's talks very much next week as well. So please do come back and join us for that. And then Thank you, Bruno, so much for this excellent talk. It was a delight. So please join me in applauding Bruno.
Thank you so much for being here and the very nice discussion. Thank you, Anna.